The words left James Mitchell's mouth before his brain caught up to them. 6 years of silence, 6 years of sawdust and solitude, and now this standing in a packed courtroom with a hammer in his calloused hand, wood shaving still clinging to his worn jeans, announcing to 200 stunned faces that he would take a $1 billion case he had no business touching. The silence that followed felt absolute. Every head turned toward the back corner where he knelt beside the witness stand, the cracked oak panel he had been repairing suddenly irrelevant. Judge Margaret Hartley's gavel froze mid-rise. The plaintiff's legal team, 4 attorneys in matching Navy suits, briefcases worth more than his truck, stared with expressions ranging from confusion to contempt. At the defendant's table, Dr. Rachel Morgan sat utterly alone, her attorney having abandoned her via email 2 hours before this hearing, and her face registered something James couldn't quite read. Not hope, not yet, but perhaps the faintest crack in the wall she'd built around herself. The thud of his work boots against the marble floor echoed as he stood. 43 years old, and he had spent the last 6 trying to be invisible, trying to occupy space without demanding attention, trying to exist in rooms full of important people without them really seeing him. That skill died the moment he opened his mouth. Now every eye tracked his movement as he stepped out of the shadows, still holding the hammer, still wearing the flannel shirt with PFC glue stains on the sleeve. Judge Hartley found her voice first. "You're Mr. Mitchell, aren't you? The courthouse maintenance supervisor?" Her tone carried genuine confusion rather than dismissal. She'd always been kind to him, treating him like a person rather than furniture during the dozens of times he'd cleaned her chambers. "That's correct, Your Honor, but I'm also a licensed attorney in this state." He reached into his back pocket, pulled out a wallet held together with duct tape, and extracted a bar card he'd carried for 6 years without ever expecting to use. "The license is currently inactive by voluntary suspension. Not revoked, not disbarred. I can reactivate it by filing paperwork and paying the fee." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Reporters grabbed their phones. Someone in the back row laughed, the sound sharp and disbelieving. Victor Strand rose from the plaintiff's table like a predator, sensing weakness. 63 years old, silver hair, immaculate suit probably worth $5,000, and a win record that read like a greatest hits compilation of corporate warfare. "Your Honor, this is absurd. The man is a carpenter. He fixes toilets and mops floors. He hasn't practiced law in how long, Mr. Mitchell? How long since you've seen the inside of a courtroom as counsel? 6 years. James met Strand's gaze without flinching. "But I was a lawyer before that. And a person doesn't stop being able to think just because they choose different work." The words came out steady, professional, with none of the hesitation he had expected after so long away. "A person doesn't stop being able to think." The phrase hung in the air, simple and stark. Some skills never left you, no matter how deeply you buried them under sawdust and silence. Judge Hartley leaned forward, her sharp eyes studying James with new intensity. "Wait, Mitchell, James Mitchell. You're that James Mitchell, aren't you, from Blackwell & Associates? The Bennett pharmaceutical case." The atmosphere shifted. Several attorneys in the gallery recognized the name, now their expressions changing from mockery to something more complicated. The Bennett case had been major news 7 years ago. James had been the architect of that victory, the rising star who dismantled a class-action lawsuit against a pharmaceutical giant accused of hiding deadly side effects. He'd won completely decisively, and the memory of that triumph still tasted like ash in his mouth. "Yes, Your Honor, that was me. No pride in the admission. Just fact." Victor Strand's face went pale, then flushed. His jaw tightened, and something flickered in his eyes, recognition mixed with old fury. The man clearly knew James. And just as clearly, he wasn't happy about this reunion. Dr. Rachel Morgan spoke for the first time, her voice cutting through the courtroom noise like a blade through silk. "Your Honor, may I speak with Mr. Mitchell privately?" "No, Dr. Morgan. If you want him to represent you, you need to decide right now." Judge Hartley's tone left no room for argument. This hearing was already delayed. She wouldn't tolerate more games. Rachel turned to face James fully. Even seated, she radiated the kind of authority that came from building something from nothing and defending it against every assault. 38 years old, wearing a black Armani suit that probably cost more than his monthly rent, hair pulled back in a severe bun that screamed control. But her hands trembled slightly where they gripped the table's edge, the only sign of vulnerability in an otherwise flawless facade. What kind of law did you practice? No warmth in the question. Pure assessment, like she was evaluating a tool for a specific job. Corporate litigation, contract disputes, intellectual property, corporate governance. Exactly what you're facing now. You've been out 6 years. You think you can just walk back in and remember how to litigate. Some skills are like riding a bicycle or knowing when someone's being railroaded. James kept his voice level conversational. I spent 5 years defending corporations that did exactly what Axiom Technologies is doing to you right now. I know their playbook, and I know how to beat them. Rachel's eyes narrowed, calculating. Why now? Why me? Because 6 years ago, I defended people who destroyed lives for profit. When I walked away, I told myself I was done with that world. But watching you sit there alone facing someone trying to bury you with legal fees and intimidation tactics, just because they can't compete fairly, I can't stand by and do nothing. The truth settled between them, unadorned and honest. Rachel studied him for 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes. Around them, the courtroom held its collective breath. She looked at Strand and his army of attorneys. She looked at the empty chair where her lawyer should have been. She looked at James with his work boots and calloused hands and the kind of direct gaze that it suggested he meant every word he just said. Fine, but I have conditions. Her voice remained controlled, offering no illusions about trust or friendship. Name them. Don't expect me to trust you. I don't trust anyone. You work, you fight, you get paid when we win. Don't expect gratitude or camaraderie. This is professional. Understand completely. And I accept. James delivered the words without hesitation. Trust had to be earned. He wasn't asking for it. He was only asking for the chance to prove himself worthy of it. Judge Hartley cleared her throat. Mr. Mitchell, you have until 5 o'clock today to reactivate your license and file paperwork indicating you're Dr. Morgan's counsel of record. Dr. Morgan, the preliminary hearing is scheduled for Tuesday next week at 9 a.m. That gives Mr. Mitchell 7 days to prepare. She paused, her expression softening just slightly. I hope you know what you're doing. I always know what I'm doing, Your Honor. Rachel's response came quick and final. Whatever fears she felt, she'd locked it away where no one could see. The gavel came down, court adjourned. The room erupted into chaos. Reporters shouting questions, spectators talking over each other, cameras flashing as James made his way toward the defendant's table. He'd just committed himself to a case that could destroy careers, exposing corporate corruption, and force him to face the life he'd abandoned years ago. The weight of that decision pressed against his chest, familiar and terrifying in equal measure. 7 years before James Mitchell had occupied a corner office on the 40th floor of Blackwell & Associates, one of the largest corporate defense firms in the state. Back then, he wore $2,000 suits and a Rolex that cost more than most people's cars. His salary hit $400,000 a year plus bonuses that doubled it. The partnership track stretched ahead of him, golden and inevitable, and everyone said he was destined for greatness. The Bennett pharmaceutical case proved them right, though not in any way that felt like victory. Bennett had developed a cardiac medication that worked brilliantly for most patients, but caused fatal strokes in a small percentage. The company knew. Internal emails proved they knew. But the drug generated $2 billion in annual revenue, and they'd buried the evidence under layers of bureaucracy and carefully worded medical disclaimers. When 47 families filed a class action lawsuit, Bennett hired Blackwell. And Blackwell assigned James as lead counsel on the defense team because he was brilliant and ruthless and completely committed to winning regardless of the moral cost. He won, completely and devastatingly. He attacked the credibility of grieving families. He buried plaintiffs under mountains of discovery requests. He used procedural maneuvers to exclude the most damaging evidence. The jury found for Bennett on all counts. The families got nothing. Bennett's stock price soared. James received a $100,000 bonus and an invitation to join the partnership. That night, he drove home at 11 p.m. exhausted and hollow to find his wife, Rebecca, waiting in their living room. She'd been crying. He could see the redness around her eyes, even though she'd tried to hide it. Sophie asked where you were tonight. Their daughter, 6 years old, with Rebecca's dark hair and James's gray eyes. She wanted to show you the pictures she drew in school. She waited until 9:30 before I could convince her to go to bed. James set down his briefcase, the leather worn smooth from 1,000 late nights. I know. The Bennett case just wrapped. It's over now. I'll have more time. You said that 3 years ago, after the Martinez merger and after the Hutchinson patent dispute. When is it enough, James? When do we get to matter more than billable hours when I make partner? When we have enough money saved that I can take my foot off the gas. We already have enough money. Rebecca's voice broke on the words. Sophie doesn't need more money. She needs her father. But you're never here. You're always at the office, always on a call, always preparing for the next case. And I can't keep pretending this is temporary. The argument spiraled from there, familiar and futile. James promised to do better. Rebecca said she'd heard it before. They went to bed angry, sleeping on opposite sides of the mattress with an ocean of resentment between them. 2 weeks later, Rebecca died. A March rainstorm turned the roads treacherous. She'd been driving Sophie home from a birthday party because James was working late again, always again, and her car hydroplaned on the highway. The crash killed her instantly. Sophie survived with a concussion and a broken arm and the kind of traumatic memory that would require years of therapy to process. James got the call at 10 p.m. while reviewing depositions for the Henderson case. He'd been so focused on work that he didn't hear his phone the first 3 times the hospital called. By the time he reached the emergency room, Rebecca's body had already been moved to the morgue. Sophie sat in a hospital bed asking why Daddy hadn't come to pick them up, why Mommy had to drive in the rain, why Daddy was never home. The guilt nearly destroyed him. If he'd left work on time, Rebecca wouldn't have been driving. If he'd prioritized his family over his career, his wife would still be alive. He'd won the Bennett case and helped a corporation avoid accountability for killing 47 people, and the universe had answered by taking the person he loved most. 3 days after the funeral, James walked into the managing partner's office and resigned. No notice period, no negotiation, no interest in the generous severance package they offered. He just left, walked out of that gleaming tower, and never looked back. The transformation took time. He enrolled in a community college carpentry program, learning to work with wood, because it felt honest in a way that corporate law never had. He studied plumbing and electrical work and basic construction. When he saw the job posting for a maintenance position at the Henderson County Courthouse, the irony didn't escape him, returning to the legal world, but as invisible labor instead of a celebrated attorney. The pay was terrible. The hours were flexible. And most importantly, it let him be present for Sophie in ways he'd failed to be when Rebecca was alive. 6 years passed in a rhythm of school drop-offs and homework help and Friday night pizza at their favorite restaurant. Sophie grew from a traumatized 6-year-old into a remarkably well-adjusted 12-year-old who understood her father had sacrificed his career to keep her safe. They lived in a modest rental house in a working-class neighborhood. James drove a 15-year-old pickup truck. His annual salary dropped 90%, but he made every school play. He knew the names of all Sophie's friends. He attended every parent-teacher conference and made her breakfast every morning and tucked her in every night. And if some part of him missed the intellectual challenge of complex litigation, he buried it under the conviction that being a good father mattered more than being a successful lawyer. Until this morning. Until he saw Dr. Rachel Morgan sitting alone at that defendant's table, abandoned and facing impossible odds, and something in his chest cracked open. The old skills stirred dormant but not dead. Maybe a person could put down a burden for 6 years and still remember how to carry it when the weight became necessary again. Outside the courthouse, Rachel Morgan moved through the crowd of reporters like an icebreaker through frozen waters, direct, unyielding, completely uninterested in their questions. The June heat shimmered off the marble steps, but she showed no sign of discomfort despite the severe black suit. Her heels clicked a steady rhythm as cameras flashed and voices competed for her attention. "Dr. Morgan, do you have any comment on your new attorney?" A reporter shoved a microphone toward her face. "Why did you hire a janitor to represent you in a billion-dollar case?" Another voice, aggressive and skeptical. "Do you really think he can win?" The questions kept coming, desperate for sound bites that would become tomorrow's headlines. Rachel stopped, removed her Prada sunglasses, fixed the crowd with eyes that could cut glass. "I didn't hire anyone. I accepted the help of someone willing to fight when everyone else ran away. Whether Mr. Mitchell has the skills to win, we'll find out soon enough. But at least he had the courage to stand up. That's more than I can say for most people." She slid the sunglasses back on and continued toward her Mercedes, effectively ending the conversation. James watched from the courthouse steps as she drove away without a backward glance. The woman radiated competence and control, but he recognized the fear underneath. She'd been betrayed by her previous attorney this very morning. Of course, she didn't trust easily. The real question was whether James could prove himself worthy of that trust in just 7 days. Mr. Mitchell's wait. A young woman with red hair and an armful of file folders jogged toward him, slightly out of breath. Please, I need to talk to you. James turned, taking in her appearance, mid-20s, wearing a cardigan, despite the heat freckles across her nose eyes that held both anxiety and determination. Who are you, Kate Sullivan? I was the paralegal for Thomas Brighton, Dr. Morgan's previous attorney. He abandoned me along with her this morning, just sent an email at 6 a.m., saying he was withdrawing from the case effective immediately. She shifted the folders to her hip, struggling with their weight. I have all the case files. 8 months of work. I know every detail. And I want to help. Why you don't know me? For all you know, I'm in over my head. James studied her face, looking for deception or ulterior motives. Because I believe in Dr. Morgan's technology. Because what she's doing matters, providing clean water to communities that can't afford the systems from companies like Axiom. Her voice gained strength as she spoke. And because I hate what they're doing to her. This lawsuit isn't about protecting intellectual property. It's about destroying competition they can't match through innovation. Kate shifted the files again, and James took half of them, the weight substantial in his arms. She hesitated, then added quietly, but I should warn you about Dr. Morgan. She's difficult to work with. Difficult how she fired Brighton twice during those 8 months, hired him back both times because she couldn't find anyone else willing to take the case. Kate's expression turned sympathetic. She micromanages everything, questions every decision, doesn't delegate, doesn't trust anyone's judgment but her own. Brighton said she was impossible, paranoid, a control freak. Did he say why James suspected he already knew the answer? He thought she was just difficult by nature. Kate's voice dropped even lower. But I think she's been burned too many times. Axiom tried to buy her out, tried to hire her away. When she refused, they sued. Her first attorney quit after 2 months. Brighton just abandoned her 2 hours before a critical hearing. She's not paranoid. She's been proven right about not trusting people. Then my job is to prove she can trust me. James spoke with more confidence than he felt. Thanks for the warning and for staying when Brighton ran. I choose conscience over career. Sometimes that's all you can do. The words carried weight beyond their simplicity. Kate Sullivan might be young, but she understood what mattered. Together, they carried the files toward James's truck, and Kate filled in details about Rachel Morgan that painted a picture of a complicated woman. 38 years old with a PhD in environmental engineering from MIT. Built pure flow systems from nothing and grew it to an $800 million valuation in just 4 years. Spent 80% of profits expanding access to clean water in poor communities rather than maximizing shareholder returns. Lived in a modest apartment and drove a 10-year-old Honda despite being a billionaire on paper. No husband, no children, no close friends that Kate knew of. Her entire life was pure flow, and the mission behind it providing water filtration technology to prevent others from experiencing the loss she'd endured. Her mother died when she was 16. Kate pulled out a file as they reached the truck. The family was visiting relatives in rural Appalachia, somewhere in West Virginia's coal country. The well water was contaminated with acid mine drainage from abandoned coal operations. Mrs. Morgan developed a waterborne illness. By the time they got her to a hospital with proper treatment, it was too late. James set down the files he was carrying, the pieces clicking together. So Rachel became an engineer to prevent that from happening to others, not just to prevent it. Kate's expression turned somber. To make sure no one else has to watch their mother die from something completely preventable. That's why this lawsuit will destroy her if she loses. It's not about the money. It's about the mission. Then we can't let her lose. The commitment settled into James's bones, solid and immovable. He'd spent 6 years avoiding this world. But maybe avoiding it had been the wrong choice. Maybe the real test wasn't walking away from power, but learning to wield it for something that mattered. Pure Flow Systems occupied a corner suite on the 30th floor of a downtown office tower, all glass walls and minimalist design. James arrived at exactly 2 p.m., accompanied by Kate and the 15 boxes of case files they'd spent the intervening hours organizing. The receptionist directed them to Dr. Morgan's office, with an expression that suggested she pitied anyone foolish enough to enter that particular lion's den. Rachel's office matched her personality, stark, functional, devoid of warmth. A glass desk dominated the space, positioned to backlight whoever sat behind it, so visitors would struggle to read her expressions. No family photos, no plants, no art on the walls except a single-frame diagram of her filtration system's patent. The windows offered a 270-degree view of the city, beautiful and isolating in equal measure. Rachel didn't stand when they entered, didn't offer handshakes or pleasantries, simply gestured to the chairs across from her desk and delivered her opening salvo in that same controlled voice from the courtroom. Sit. 7 days to prepare for a hearing that could end my company. Brighton worked 8 months. You have 1 week. She leaned forward slightly, her silhouette sharp against the afternoon light. Tell me, Mr. Mitchell, how exactly do you plan to accomplish that I don't promise we'll win in 7 days, but I promise we'll survive the preliminary hearing? The goal isn't victory right now. The goal is avoiding dismissal, so we have time for a full trial. Not good enough. Rachel's response came fast and final. With all due respect, Dr. Morgan, good enough isn't your option anymore. Brighton abandoned you this morning. You've got me or you represent yourself. So which do you want, a miracle or someone willing to fight? James kept his tone even, but firm. He wouldn't promise what he couldn't deliver, and pretending otherwise would insult them both. The silence stretched taut between them. Rachel studied him with eyes that missed nothing, searching for weakness or deception or whatever fatal flaw had characterized every other person who tried to help her. Whatever she saw, it must have passed some minimum threshold because she gave a single sharp nod. Fine. Show me your strategy. First, I need to understand something. James settled into the chair, aware of Kate arranging files in the corner with practiced efficiency. Tell me about your mother. Rachel froze. Her expression went from controlled to stone in an instant, and her hands tightened where they rested on the desk. That's not relevant to the case. It is relevant. The jury needs to understand why you do this. Not just what you invented, but why it matters. James kept his voice gentle but persistent. They need to see you as a person, not just a defendant. Rachel stood abruptly and turned toward the windows, her back rigid with tension. The silence extended 10 seconds to 20, 30. When she finally spoke, her voice remained controlled, but held an undercurrent of something raw. I was 16 years old. We were visiting my grandmother in West Virginia coal country. Small town, mostly abandoned after the mines closed. The well water was contaminated with acid runoff. No one knew until people started getting sick. Her shoulders stayed perfectly straight, military precise. My mother drank that water, developed a severe illness. By the time we got her to a hospital with proper facilities, her organs were already failing. She died 3 days later. Another pause. Rachel's hands clasped behind her back, knuckles white with pressure. I became an engineer to prevent that from happening to other families. Not out of kindness, out of anger. Because I don't want anyone else to watch their mother die from something that could have been prevented with basic water quality testing and affordable filtration. She turned back to face James, her expression utterly blank. Now you have your story. Don't waste it. The wall slammed back into place, higher and thicker than before. Rachel returned to her desk and sat with the kind of deliberate composure that screamed barely contained emotion. Kate glanced at James with wide eyes. Apparently, this was more personal information than Rachel had shared in 8 months of working with Brighton. Thank you for trusting me with that. James spoke quietly, acknowledging the gift she'd just given, even if she'd wrapped it in hostility. Don't thank me, just win. Rachel pulled a file toward herself, effectively ending that line of conversation. Start working. Kate will show you what Brighton compiled. The next 3 hours passed in a blur of legal documents and technical specifications. Kate proved invaluable, walking James through Axiom's allegations with the kind of detailed knowledge that came from living inside a case for months. The picture that emerged looked damning on the surface but fell apart under scrutiny. Axiom Technologies claimed Rachel had stolen their intellectual property during a 6-month consulting period 3 years earlier. They demanded $200 million in damages, plus ownership of all PureFlow patents, which would effectively destroy Rachel's company and eliminate a competitor whose technology outperformed theirs at 1/10 the cost. Their evidence seemed overwhelming at first glance. Rachel had signed a consulting contract giving her access to Axiom's research database. Computer logs proved she'd viewed their filtration system designs. Their expert witness, Dr. Stephen Bradford from MIT, concluded the similarities between systems were too extensive to be coincidental, suggesting intellectual property theft. But Kate had organized the files in a way that revealed the critical flaw in Axiom's narrative. Every innovation they claimed Rachel stole existed in her work before she ever met Axiom. Her PhD dissertation from 2019 described the ceramic UV filtration combination. Her published papers from 2020 detailed the mathematical optimization of flow rates. Her patent applications from 2021 documented the modular design approach. The Axiom consulting happened in 2022 after all of those breakthroughs. This is our foundation. James traced the timeline with his finger, the pattern clear and undeniable. Chronology doesn't lie. Everything they claim she stole, she invented first and documented publicly. Brighton knew that. Kate pulled out another file, this one containing the previous attorney's strategy memos. But he played defense instead of offense. Tried to prove Dr. Morgan was innocent rather than forcing Axiom to prove she was guilty. He never went after their motives or challenged why they were really filing this lawsuit. James flipped through Brighton's notes, recognizing the defensive posture immediately. He'd seen it before in attorneys who let their opponents control the narrative. So we changed that. We don't defend, we attack. We force them to explain why they're claiming theft when all the evidence shows Rachel innovated first. He kept reading and 40 minutes later found the key that Brighton had somehow missed. Dr. Robert Kane's deposition buried in the middle of a 300-page document. Kane had been Axiom's research director during Rachel's consulting period and left the company 6 months before the lawsuit was filed. His testimony contained casual observations that Brighton had glossed over, but James recognized as explosive. Kate, look at this. James read aloud from pages 47 through 63. Kane says Axiom's research during the consulting period was preliminary, not production ready. He says they had significant technical problems. And listen to this, he says they extensively studied Dr. Morgan's published papers because her approach was more elegant than theirs. Kate leaned over his shoulder, reading the highlighted sections. Brighton didn't follow up on any of that. He just asked a few basic questions and moved on, because Brighton didn't know what he was looking for. But I do. James felt the old instincts stirring, the pattern recognition that had made him so effective as a corporate litigator. And here's the bombshell Kane mentions in an internal meeting where executives discussed how to compete with PureFlow. One VP said, and I quote, "If we can't beat her technology, we need to beat her in court." That's admission of bad faith. Kate's eyes widened. That's proof they're using litigation as a weapon instead of legitimate IP protection. Exactly. We need Kane as a witness at the hearing. James started making notes, the strategy crystallizing in his mind. He flips their whole narrative. It's not Rachel learning from Axiom, it's Axiom trying to copy Rachel and failing, then suing her to tie up her operations with legal costs. Kate hesitated. He won't testify willingly. Axiom has threatened him with NDA violations. He's scared for his career. Then we get a protective order from the judge. James spoke with more confidence than he felt. This testimony is too important to lose. They worked until the sky outside turned orange with sunset, building the framework of a defense that felt more like a counterattack. By the time James glanced at his watch, it was nearly 8 p.m., and he realized with a jolt of guilt that he'd promised Sophie he'd be home for dinner. Rachel had left hours ago without saying goodbye, just stood and walked out when the clock hit 6, her departure, as abrupt and impersonal as everything else about her. Kate started packing up files, exhaustion evident in the set of her shoulders. "You should go home." James began gathering his own materials. "This is going to be a long week. We both need rest." Kate nodded but didn't move immediately. "Mr. Mitchell, can I ask you something?" "Call me James. And yes, why did you really take this case?" Kate's question came soft but direct. "It's not just about helping someone in need. There's something else." James considered deflecting, then decided honesty served better. 6 years ago, I defended a pharmaceutical company that killed 47 people. I won, got them off completely, and I've been trying to atone for that ever since by becoming invisible." He met Kate's eyes. "This is my chance to use those same skills for something that actually matters. To prove that maybe all those years weren't wasted if I can apply them the right way. You feel guilty. Kate's words held understanding rather than judgment. Every day. But guilt without action is just self-indulgence. Maybe this case lets me turn guilt into something useful. Kate smiled for the first time since they'd met. Dr. Morgan chose well, even if she doesn't realize it yet. The drive home took James through familiar streets, past the elementary school Sophie had attended, and the grocery store where they did their weekly shopping, and the life he'd built from the ruins of his previous existence. The modest rental house sat dark when he pulled up. Sophie was staying with her best friend's family for the week, understanding, without being told, that her father needed to focus completely on this case. Still, James called her before going inside. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright with the kind of easy happiness that still surprised him sometimes. "Hey, Dad, how was court intense? We survived the first day." James unlocked the front door, stepping into the quiet emptiness. "How's staying with Emma's family?" "Good. Her mom made lasagna, and we're working on our science project." Sophie paused, then asked more seriously, "Dad, are you okay? You sound tired." "I am tired, but I'm okay." He collapsed onto the couch, suddenly aware of how much energy the day had demanded. "I miss you, though. I miss you, too." "But, Dad," Sophie's voice took on that particular tone of 12-year-old wisdom that sometimes felt older than her years. "I'm glad you're doing this. Mom would be proud." The words hit harder than expected. "Why do you think that?" "Because she always said you were happiest when you were fighting for something that mattered. You've been hiding for 6 years, and I get why. But maybe it's time to stop hiding." She delivered the observation with simple directness, no malice or manipulation. Just truth from someone who knew him better than anyone. "When did you get so wise?" James asked, throat tight. "I learned from watching you." "I love you, Dad." "Love you too, kiddo. Get some sleep." After they hung up, James sat in the dark living room and looked at the wedding photo on the mantel. Rebecca smiling young and alive before cancer and loss and guilt had written themselves into his story. He'd told himself for 6 years that walking away from law was about being present for Sophie. And it was. But Sophie was right that hiding had been part of it too. Hiding from the guilt of what he'd done. Hiding from the pressure that had consumed him. Hiding from having to face himself in the mirror and reconcile the person he'd been with the person he wanted to become. Maybe this case was his chance to stop hiding, to use what he knew for something that actually helped people instead of crushing them. The thought terrified and energized him in equal measure. Thursday morning arrived with oppressive heat and a mountain of work. James met Kate at a coffee shop near the courthouse at 7 a.m. Both of them bleary-eyed but determined. They spread files across a corner's table and dove into the discovery documents that Brighton had collected but never properly analyzed. The pattern became clearer with each page. Axiom had filed this lawsuit not to protect legitimate intellectual property rights, but to bury a competitor they couldn't match through innovation. Every legal brief they'd submitted used vague language about similarities without identifying specific proprietary elements Rachel had allegedly stolen. Their expert witness, Dr. Bradford, talked in generalities about technical approaches, but never pointed to concrete innovations unique to Axiom. It was smoke and mirrors, James realized. Sophisticated and expensive smoke and mirrors, but smoke nonetheless. Axiom was counting on judges and juries being intimidated by expert credentials and corporate authority, unable to see through the misdirection to the weakness underneath. The real breakthrough came when Kate found an email buried deep in the discovery files. The thread dated from 3.5 years ago, before Axiom ever filed their lawsuit. James read it 3 times, unable to believe Brighton had missed something this damning. From James Thornton, Axiom's CEO, to the corporate development team. Subject line: Pure Flow Acquisition Strategy. The email laid out a clear plan approach, Rachel with a job offer for VP of Research at $2 million annually. If she accepted, shelve the affordable technology and focus only on premium markets. If she declined, consider IP litigation to tie up her operations and force a settlement. Kate, this is it. James looked up from his laptop screen. This proves they planned to sue her from the beginning. It wasn't about protecting their rights. It was plan B when they couldn't buy her. Should we call Dr. Morgan? Kate already had her phone out. The call connected after 2 rings. Rachel's voice came through cool and professional. "What, doctor?" "Morgan, did Axiom offer you a job about 3.5 years ago?" James kept his tone neutral, not wanting to lead her response. A long pause. Yes, VP of Research. 2 million a year. Why, what made you turn it down? Rachel's voice dropped even colder if that was possible. Because I saw through it. They wanted to hire me to bury my own technology. Price it high enough that only wealthy communities could afford it. I didn't spend 10 years developing this system to save lives just to turn it into a luxury product for the rich. I refused. 6 months later, they sued me. We just found the email that proves it. James explained about Thornton's message, the acquisition strategy, the litigation as a backup plan. This shows their lawsuit is retaliation for refusing to be bought out. It's not legitimate IP protection, it's anti-competitive conduct. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that James wondered if the connection had dropped. Then Rachel spoke, and for the first time her voice carried something warmer than ice. Mr. Mitchell, I may have been wrong about you. Wrong how I thought you'd be like Brighton, looking for an exit when things got difficult. But you're actually fighting. Really fighting. I promised I would. I keep my promises. The words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what was shifting between them, but James meant them completely. Another pause. Then so quietly he almost missed it. Thank you. The line went dead before he could respond. Kate was staring at him with an expression of wonder. She thanked you. I worked with her for 8 months and never once heard her thank anyone for anything. The wall is cracking. James felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest, not quite hope, but maybe the possibility of it. Now we just need to prove we deserve that trust. Friday brought James face to face with the past he'd been avoiding. He needed to file formal paperwork with the court indicating he was Rachel's counsel of record, which meant delivering documents to the offices of Morrison and Strand, LLP. The law firm occupied the top 5 floors of the city's most expensive tower, all marble and mahogany, and the kind of ostentatious wealth that reminded James why he'd left this world. Victor Strand was waiting in the reception area when James arrived, as if he'd been expecting this confrontation. The older man gestured toward his private office without a word, and James followed, aware that whatever came next would set the tone for everything that followed. Strand's office could have been featured in architectural magazines, floor-to-ceiling windows, custom furniture, original art worth more than James's house. The man settled behind his desk with the casual authority of someone who'd never questioned his right to occupy powerful spaces. Mitchell. After all these years. Strand's voice carried layers of meaning James couldn't quite parse. Strand, you don't remember, do you? The Bennett pharmaceutical case. 7 years ago. Strand leaned back in his leather chair, his smile sharp and humorless. You destroyed me. I represented the plaintiffs, those families whose loved ones died from Bennett's cardiac medication. You dismantled my case so thoroughly that I lost my biggest client and spent 2 years rebuilding my reputation. The memory slammed into James with unexpected force. He'd been so focused on winning that he'd never thought much about the attorney on the other side, just another obstacle to overcome. But Strand remembered. Strand had carried that defeat for 7 years, let it fester into something bitter and personal. And now you think you can walk back in after 6 years of fixing toilets and beat me again. Strand's voice held genuine contempt. You're Rusty Mitchell, out of practice. And you're representing a client everyone knows is guilty. I'm representing someone innocent who's being crushed by a corporation that can't compete fairly. James kept his voice level despite the anger building in his chest. You want to make this personal, that's your choice. But it doesn't change the facts. The facts are that Dr. Morgan had access to Axiom's research and launched a competing product. She's a thief, and I'm going to prove it. Strand stood moving to the windows with practiced grace. When this is over, you'll remember why you left law, because you couldn't handle the pressure. Your wife died and you ran away. The words were designed to wound and they succeeded. James felt his hands curl into fists before he consciously relaxed them. I didn't run because I was weak. I left because I was strong enough to know what mattered. And I'm back because I found something worth fighting for again. Not money, not reputation, justice. Strand laughed to sound cold and mocking. Justice. How noble. We'll see how noble you feel when I destroy you and your client in open court. See you Tuesday, counselor. James turned and walked out, refusing to give Strand the satisfaction of seeing how deeply the conversation had shaken him. The man was good, ruthless, and skilled, and carrying a 7-year grudge that would make him fight even harder. But James had something Strand didn't. He had the truth. And he had a client whose mission actually mattered. Sometimes that had to be enough. The weekend disappeared into a blur of preparation. James, Rachel, and Kate worked 18-hour days at PureFlow's offices, building the defense strategy piece by piece. Kate created a visual timeline showing every one of Rachel's innovations documented and dated before the Axiom consulting period. Rachel wrote a technical explanation of her filtration system that was both scientifically rigorous and accessible to non-experts. James drafted legal briefs and prepared cross-examination questions for Axiom's witnesses. Late Sunday afternoon, as they reviewed the timeline for the 10th time, Rachel surprised James by asking a personal question. "Tell me about your daughter." James looked up from his notes, caught off guard. "What do you want to know?" "Why she matters so much that you gave up everything for her?" Rachel's usual armor had thinned slightly with exhaustion. Most people wouldn't make that choice. Most people didn't watch their wife die because they chose work over family. James set down his pen. "Sophie was 6 when her mother died. I'd missed so many moments, birthdays, school plays, bedtimes. When Rebecca died, I realized I'd been given a second chance. Not with my wife, but with my daughter. I wasn't going to waste it." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "I never wanted children. My work always felt more important. But sometimes I wonder what I missed." "You didn't miss anything. You chose a different kind of legacy, saving lives through technology instead of raising a person. Both matter." James met her eyes. "And for what it's worth, I think your mother would be proud of what you've built." Rachel's composure cracked just slightly, her eyes brightening with unshed tears. "Thank you. That means more than you know." The moment passed quickly, Rachel rebuilding her barnos with practiced efficiency. But James had seen underneath, if only briefly, and what he'd found there wasn't ice at all. Just someone who'd been hurt so many times that protecting herself had become second nature. By Sunday at 3 a.m., they'd constructed something that felt less like a defense and more like a comprehensive attack on Axiom's credibility. The preliminary hearing wouldn't decide the case, but it would determine whether they survived to fight another day. That survival depended on proving to Judge Hartley that genuine disputes of fact existed, that the question of Rachel's innocence required a full trial rather than summary dismissal. James sat alone in the conference room after Rachel and Kate had finally gone home, reviewing his notes one more time. The exhaustion pressed against him like a physical weight, but his mind kept circling back to the central question. Could he really do this? 6 years away from litigation, facing one of the best corporate attorneys in the state, with a client who trusted him despite every instinct screaming otherwise. His phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. "Dad, remember what you taught me? Skills don't betray people who have them. You have the skills. You'll win. Love you." The message arrived at exactly the moment he needed it most. James typed back quickly. "Love you too, kiddo. Home soon." Then he gathered his materials and drove through empty streets to the house that felt less lonely, knowing Sophie would be back in a few days. Monday morning arrived with crystalline clarity, the kind of perfect June weather that felt like a gift or a taunt, depending on your perspective. James stood in his bedroom, staring at the suit hanging in his closet, the same suit he'd worn 6 years ago when he walked away from Blackwell and Associates. It still fit, though the fabric pulled slightly across shoulders that had grown broader from carpentry work. Sophie had come home Sunday night insisting she wanted to make breakfast on this important day. Now she sat across from him at their small kitchen table, watching him push scrambled eggs around his plate. "You're nervous." Not a question. An observation delivered with the kind of insight that reminded James how perceptive his daughter had become. Terrified, no point lying to her. She'd see through it anyway. "Why, you've done this before. Done this. You were good at it." Sophie took a bite of toast, completely matter-of-fact about the situation. "I was good 7 years ago. That's a lifetime in law. And I'm facing someone who hates me personally and has every advantage." James set down his fork, appetite gone, despite knowing he needed the fuel. Sophie reached across the table and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong for a 12-year-old. "Dad, you told me once that skills don't betray people who have them. You have the skills. They didn't disappear just because you chose to use different ones for a while." A pause then. "And you're fighting for something right this time. That matters. When did you get so wise?" The question came out choked with emotion. "I learned from watching you and Mom. You taught me that doing the right thing is more important than doing the easy thing. She squeezed his hand once more before letting go. Now go prove it. The courthouse steps were already crowded when James arrived at 8:45. Reporters formed a gauntlet he had to push through, cameras flashing and questions flying. He ignored them all, focusing on the glass doors ahead and the battle waiting beyond them. Inside the building, the familiar marble halls echoed with footsteps and nervous conversations. James made his way to courtroom 6, the same room where this had all started just 7 days ago. Hard to believe only a week had passed since he'd knelt by that witness stand and changed everything. Kate was already there setting up documents with practiced efficiency. She looked up when James entered and offered a tight smile. Ready as we'll ever be, Rachel arrived 10 minutes later, stepping out of her Mercedes with the same controlled grace she brought to everything. The black suit, the severe hairstyle, the expression that gave away nothing. But when she saw James waiting by the courthouse entrance, something in her face softened just fractionally. They walked in together side by side, and for the first time since this began, Rachel Morgan wasn't facing her legal battle alone. James let the courtroom noise settle before continuing, his eyes moving across the jury box where 12 empty seats waited for the trial that might never come if Strand won this motion. Let's start with what Mr. Strand conveniently omits from his timeline. Access means nothing without context. Yes, Dr. Morgan consulted for Axiom. Yes, she viewed their research files. But what were those files, and when did her innovations actually occur? Kate stood and unfurled the timeline poster they'd spent hours perfecting, a visual representation that stretched 6 feet across and couldn't be ignored. The colors coded by year, the dates stamped and verified, the progression of Rachel's work laid out with undeniable clarity. This is Dr. Morgan's research history. Every innovation Axiom claims she stole existed in her work before she ever met them. James pointed to the earliest entries. PhD dissertation 2019 describes the ceramic UV filtration combination. Published in peer-reviewed journals 2020, details the mathematical optimization of flow rates. Patent applications filed 2021, documents the modular design approach. He moved his finger to the right side of the timeline. Axiom Consulting period 2022. After all of those breakthroughs, Strand shifted in his seat, but his expression remained carefully neutral. Judge Hartley leaned forward, studying the timeline with visible interest. Chronology doesn't lie. Your Honor, everything Axiom claims Dr. Morgan stole from them, she invented first. She documented it publicly. She published it in academic journals anyone could read. The question isn't whether she had access to their research, it's why they're claiming ownership of innovations that were already part of the public record when she walked into their building. The argument landed with weight that James could feel in the room's energy. Several spectators in the gallery exchanged glances. A reporter in the back row typed furiously on her laptop. Rachel's shoulders straightened slightly, the first sign of hope he'd seen from her. But James wasn't finished. Mr. Strand also relies heavily on Dr. Bradford's expert opinion. Let me address that directly. He pulled out the expert report pages flagged with sticky notes marking the relevant sections. Dr. Bradford concludes that the similarities between systems are too extensive for coincidence, but he never identifies a single specific proprietary innovation that Axiom developed and Dr. Morgan allegedly stole. Not one concrete element, just vague language about technical approaches and design philosophies. James read directly from the report, his voice cutting through the courtroom stillness. Quote, "The combination of ceramic filtration and UV sterilization shows clear influence." Unquote. Ceramic filtration has been in use since the 1990s. UV sterilization is equally standard. Neither is proprietary to Axiom or anyone else. He flipped to another flag page. Quote, "The modular design approach suggests shared development." Unquote. Modular design is common across the water filtration industry. Dr. Bradford knows this. His own published research uses modular systems. So why is it suspicious when Dr. Morgan does the same? The answer, Your Honor, is that it isn't suspicious. It's industry standard practice. And Dr. Bradford's opinion collapses when you ask him to be specific instead of general. Because specificity would reveal what Axiom doesn't want this court to see. They have no proprietary innovations that Dr. Morgan could have stolen. Strand's jaw tightened visibly now. The first crack in his composure. James pressed the advantage, pulling out another document Kate had excavated from the discovery files. We also have testimony from Dr. Robert Kane, Axiom's former research director. Dr. Kane worked there during the entire period Dr. Morgan consulted. His deposition describes Axiom's research as preliminary, not production-ready, facing significant technical problems. He testified that Axiom's research team extensively studied Dr. Morgan's published papers because her approach was more elegant than theirs. Let me repeat that. Axiom's own research director testified that they were learning from Dr. Morgan's publicly available work, not the other way around. That fundamentally undermines the theft narrative Mr. Strand wants this court to accept. Your Honor, the witness is a disgruntled former employee. Strand rose halfway from his chair, unable to contain himself. Mr. Strand, you'll have your opportunity to respond. Judge Hartley's voice carried steel underneath the professional courtesy. Mr. Mitchell, continue. James nodded his thanks. Dr. Kane's employment status doesn't change the facts of his testimony. He was there. He led the research. And he described a company trying to catch up to innovation they couldn't match, not protecting intellectual property they developed first. The final piece of Axiom's motion relies on the allegation that Dr. Morgan launched a competing product shortly after leaving their employment. But 18 months is not shortly. And more importantly, Dr. Morgan founded PureFlow Systems in 22 years before she ever consulted for Axiom. The company and its core mission existed before this alleged theft could have occurred. James gathered his papers, preparing for the conclusion. Your Honor, summary judgment is appropriate only when no genuine disputes of material fact exist. But this case is built on factual disputes. Did Axiom's research predate Dr. Morgan's? The timeline says no. Are the similarities evidence of theft or evidence of industry standards? That's disputed. Is Dr. Bradford's opinion reliable when it lacks any specific identification of stolen elements? That's disputed. These are exactly the questions that require a full trial where evidence can be tested through cross-examination and witnesses can be challenged on their conclusions. Axiom wants this court to accept their version of events without scrutiny. But the facts demand scrutiny. The facts demand a trial. He looked directly at Judge Hartley, meeting her eyes with the confidence of someone who believed every word he'd just spoken. Therefore, we respectfully request that this court deny Axiom's motion for summary judgment and allow this case to proceed to trial where the truth can be fully examined. The silence after James sat down felt different from the silence after Strand's argument. This one carried uncertainty, the sense that what had seemed inevitable might not be so certain after all. Rachel's hand found his under the table, just a brief touch, gone almost immediately, but carrying volumes of unspoken gratitude. Judge Hartley removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose, a gesture James remembered from his time practicing before her years ago. It meant she was genuinely wrestling with the decision rather than having made up her mind already. Mr. Strand, your rebuttal. She replaced the glasses and fixed the senior attorney with an expectant look. Strand approached the podium with controlled precision, though James noticed the slight stiffness in his movements that suggested anger barely contained. Your Honor, Mr. Mitchell presents an appealing narrative about the innovative underdog versus the powerful corporation. But let's examine what he conveniently omits. Access is undisputed. Dr. Morgan signed agreements giving her full access to Axiom's research database. She viewed files on filtration systems, on UV sterilization methods, on cost optimization strategies. Computer logs prove this. Those aren't allegations, they're documented facts. The similarities between systems aren't just about using ceramic filters or UV lights. They're about the specific integration of those elements, the particular mathematical ratios used in the filtration process, the exact configuration of the modular assembly. These are too precise to be coincidence. As for Dr. Kane, he left Axiom after performance issues that we've documented thoroughly. His testimony is motivated by bitterness toward his former employer, not objective assessment of the facts. And regarding the timeline Mr. Mitchell finds so compelling, having published research in one area doesn't prevent someone from later appropriating specific implementations they observed elsewhere. Strand's voice gained momentum, the practiced rhythm of a closing argument delivered too early. The pattern here is clear. Dr. Morgan consulted for Axiom, gained access to their proprietary methods, and then launched a product that benefited from that access. Whether her basic research predated the consulting is irrelevant if she refined and commercialized it using knowledge obtained under confidentiality agreements. Your Honor, we're not asking you to accept our version without scrutiny. We're asking you to recognize that when the evidence overwhelmingly points in one direction, a trial becomes unnecessary theatrics rather than justice. Summary judgment exists precisely for cases like this, where the facts are clear and the outcome foreordained. He returned to his seat looking satisfied that he'd repaired whatever damage James's arguments had inflicted. But Judge Hartley's expression remained troubled, her pen tapping against her notepad in a rhythm that suggested deep consideration. The courtroom held its breath. Reporters poised over keyboards. Axiom's representatives whispered among themselves. Rachel sat motionless beside James, her face a mask of control that didn't quite hide the fear underneath. Counselors, I've heard your arguments. Judge Hartley's voice cut through the tension. Mr. Strand, your motion is well crafted, and the evidence appears substantial on its surface. However, Mr. Mitchell has identified factual disputes that concern me deeply. The timeline is significant. If Dr. Morgan's innovations genuinely predate her work with Axiom, that undermines the foundation of your theft claim. Dr. Bradford's expert opinion, while extensive, does lack the kind of specific identification of proprietary elements that would make the similarities conclusive rather than suggestive. And Dr. Kane's testimony, regardless of his employment history, raises legitimate questions about Axiom's research status during the relevant period. Strand's face went carefully blank, the expression of a lawyer who just realized a sure victory might be slipping away. These disputes are material to the central questions of this case. They cannot be resolved on paper alone. They require the kind of thorough examination that only a full trial can provide. Judge Hartley closed the file in front of her with finality. Therefore, Axiom's motion for summary judgment is denied. The gallery erupted. Kate grabbed Rachel's arm with barely suppressed joy. James felt something uncoil in his chest, not quite relief because the battle was far from over, but vindication that his instincts about the case had been sound. This case will proceed to trial. Judge Hartley's gavel came down hard, demanding order. Trial date is set for 8 weeks from today. Both parties will complete all remaining discovery, prepare witnesses, and file any additional motions within that time frame. I expect good faith settlement discussions during this period. She looked directly at Strand, her meaning unmistakable. Particularly given that your motion for quick resolution has failed, Mr. Strand. Perhaps your client should reconsider their approach. We'll certainly discuss settlement options, Your Honor. Strand's voice remained professional, but James could hear the anger underneath. Court is adjourned. The gavel sounded again, and people began gathering belongings, standing talking in excited clusters about what they'd just witnessed. Rachel turned to James, and for the first time since they'd met, genuine warmth broke through her controlled facade. Her eyes shone with unshed tears she refused to let fall. Thank you. I don't know how you did that, but thank you. We're not finished. Just beginning. James kept his voice low, not wanting to celebrate prematurely. 8 weeks to build a case that can actually win at trial. But we have a chance now, a real one. Rachel's smile transformed her face, made her look younger and less hardened. That's more than I had yesterday. The hallway outside the courtroom turned into a circus. Reporters surrounded them immediately, questions flying from every direction. James deflected most of them with practiced non-answers, but Rachel surprised him by stopping to address the crowd directly. The judge recognized what we've known from the beginning, that Axiom's allegations don't hold up under scrutiny. We look forward to proving Dr. Morgan's innocence at trial. Her voice carried absolute conviction, the kind that made headlines and shaped public opinion. They pushed through to the parking garage where Kate was loading files into James's truck with efficiency born of long practice. She looked up as they approached, grinning widely. That was incredible. The way you dismantled Bradford's opinion, the timeline presentation, the Kane testimony preview. Strand never saw it coming. He saw it coming, James corrected her gently. He just didn't think I had the skills to execute it. His mistake. A voice called from across the garage, cold and sharp. Mitchell, wait. Victor Strand approached alone, having dismissed his team of associates. Up close, the anger that he'd controlled in court showed clearly in the tension around his eyes and mouth. His 63 years sat heavily on him now. the burden of a loss he hadn't anticipated. That was quite a performance. Strand stopped a few feet away, maintaining careful distance. Almost like old times. Except you're rusty and you got lucky with a sympathetic judge. Luck had nothing to do with it. The facts are on our side. James kept his tone neutral, not wanting to escalate into something uglier. The facts, Strand's voice dropped lower, more personal. You always did have a gift for narrative, Mitchell. Making juries and judges believe what you wanted them to believe, regardless of underlying truth. That's what you did in the Bennett case. That's what you're doing now, the Bennett case. The words hung between them, weighted with history James had tried to forget. You destroyed me in that trial. Strand stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper, but sharp as broken glass. I represented those families. 47 people dead from medication they thought was safe. Their loved ones deserved justice. And you took it from them with legal technicalities and character assassination. My biggest client dropped me after that loss. Took me 2 years to rebuild what you destroyed in 3 weeks of trial. I remember. James met Strand's gaze without flinching. I remember winning a case I shouldn't have won for a client that didn't deserve to win. That's why I left law. Because I couldn't live with what I'd become. But now you're back, Strand's smile turned predatory. Playing hero for a billionaire who's just as guilty as any client you defended before. You think working as a janitor for 6 years absolves you. You think one righteous case erases the harm you've done. The accusation cut deeper than James wanted to admit because part of him wondered the same thing. Could doing right now make up for doing wrong before? Was redemption even possible or just a comfortable fiction, he told himself? This is different, James forced steel into his voice. Rachel Morgan isn't guilty. She's being crushed by a corporation that can't compete fairly. That's the truth, not narrative. We'll see at trial. Strand's eyes glittered with cold promise. And when I destroy your case and your client, when the jury sees through this performance, to the reality underneath, you'll remember why you ran away 6 years ago. Because you're not strong enough to handle the pressure. You never were. I didn't run because I was weak. The words came out quiet but absolute. I left because I finally understood what mattered. My wife died because I prioritized winning over everything else. My daughter nearly lost both parents because I couldn't see past the next case, so I chose differently. I chose to be present for the person who needed me most. He took a breath, meeting Strand's bitter gaze with something approaching pity. And I'm back now because I found something worth fighting for. Not money or reputation or revenge. Justice. Real justice, not the perverted version we practiced when winning mattered more than truth. You want to make this personal, fine. But it won't change the facts of the case. Strand's jaw worked like he wanted to say more, to land another verbal blow that would break through James's composure. But something in James's steady gaze must have convinced him further argument was pointless. The older attorney turned and walked back toward his luxury sedan without another word. Kate appeared at James's elbow, her voice careful. You okay, fine? The lie came automatically, but Kate's skeptical look suggested she didn't believe it. He has history with me. Bad history. Is going to make the trial more difficult. Because he hates you, Rachel joined them, her earlier warmth replaced by shrewd assessment. Because he has something to prove. James watched Strand's car exit the garage, tires squealing slightly on the concrete. To him, this case isn't about intellectual property or corporate rights. It's about revenge. And that makes him dangerous. More dangerous than someone just doing their job. Rachel's question carried genuine curiosity rather than fear. Much more dangerous. A lawyer fighting for a paycheck will take reasonable settlement offers and make strategic compromises. A lawyer fighting to settle old scores will burn everything down rather than lose. James turned back to face them both. We need to be perfect, no mistakes, no vulnerabilities he can exploit. Then we'd better get to work. Kate pulled out her phone, already scrolling through task lists. 8 weeks sounds like a lot until you break down everything we need to accomplish. The 8 weeks that followed tested James in ways he hadn't experienced since leaving Blackwell and Associates. The days blurred into an endless cycle of research and preparation, depositions, and document review strategy sessions that stretched past midnight. He maintained his presence in Sophie's life, still made breakfast most mornings, still checked homework every evening, still kept their sacred Friday night pizza tradition, but the hours between were consumed by Rachel's case. Week 1 brought intensive discovery work. James deposed 3 Axiom engineers who'd worked during Rachel's consulting period. Under careful questioning, each admitted they'd studied Rachel's published research extensively. One engineer even acknowledged that her approach was more elegant than anything Axiom had developed internally. Axiom deposed Rachel for 2 grueling days. Strand's cross-examination bordered on harassment, probing every detail of her consulting and work, every file she'd accessed, every conversation she'd had with Axiom employees. But James had prepared her well. She answered with technical precision, never defensive, never emotional, just stating facts in that same controlled voice she brought to everything. Week 2 saw the relationship between James and Rachel shift in subtle ways. She started arriving at prep sessions 15 minutes early to ask about Sophie. He found himself sharing stories about his daughter's science fair project, and Rachel listened with genuine interest rather than polite tolerance. She mentioned in passing that she'd never wanted children because her work consumed everything, but there was a wistfulness in her voice that suggested regret for roads not taken. Week 3 brought the discovery of Thomas Brighton's betrayal. Kate had been digging into the circumstances of his withdrawal, bothered by the timing and the vague email explanation. She found a shell company payment to Brighton 2 days before he abandoned Rachel, $200,000 from an entity that traced back through 3 layers of corporate ownership to an Axiom subsidiary. James stared at the bank records spread across the conference table, fury building in his chest. They bribed him. Axiom paid Rachel's own attorney to quit right before the most critical hearing. Kate nodded, her face tight with anger. And there's more. She pulled up emails on her laptop. Brighton's work email account was supposed to be deleted when he left the firm, but IT hadn't gotten to it yet. I found correspondence with Axiom's general counsel. They threatened him with a fabricated ethics complaint if he didn't withdraw. So they used carrot and stick. $200,000 to make it worth his while, plus threats to destroy his career if he refused. James felt sick, imagining the calculation Brighton must have made: betray a client or risk everything. Most people would have chosen exactly as he did. This is witness tampering. Kate's voice shook with suppressed emotion. It's illegal, and it proves Axiom knows their case is weak. They wouldn't need to eliminate Rachel's attorney if they were confident about winning on merit. Can we prove it? Not just suspect it, prove it in court. James needed certainty before making accusations this serious. The bank records are solid. The emails are admissible. And if we can get Brighton to testify— Kate trailed off, knowing how unlikely that was. He won't testify willingly. He took their money. Admitting it means losing his license. James drummed his fingers on the table, thinking through options. But if we subpoena him and he lies under oath, that's perjury. We can threaten him with that. It took 3 conversations before Brighton agreed to meet. They sat in a coffee shop far from the courthouse, the disgraced attorney looking haggard and defeated. His suit was wrinkled. His eyes carried the exhaustion of someone not sleeping well. I know why you're here. Brighton didn't wait for James to start. You found the payment. We found everything: the money, the threats, the emails. James kept his voice level, not accusatory. The question is what you're going to do about it. What can I do? Brighton's laugh sounded broken. I already destroyed my career. Testifying will just make it public. Your career is already gone. But you can choose how it ends, as someone who stayed bought or someone who finally did the right thing. James leaned forward, holding Brighton's gaze. Testify. Tell the judge what Axiom did. It won't absolve you, but it might help you sleep better. Brighton stared into his coffee for a full minute before responding. If I testify, they'll come after me legally. They have resources I can't match. They'll come after you anyway. But if you testify, you're protected as a witness. And more importantly, you stop letting them use you. James softened his tone slightly. I've been where you are. Compromising my integrity for money and security. It eats at you. The only way out is through truth. The silence stretched long enough that James thought Brighton would refuse. Then the older attorney nodded once, sharp and final. I'll testify. Tell me when and where. Week 4 brought complications with Dr. Robert Kane's testimony. James had counted on Kane's statement about Axiom's internal discussions regarding litigation strategy. But when he met with Kane to prepare for trial, the scientist dropped a bombshell that threatened their entire approach. I need to tell you something about my NDA. Kane looked miserable, seated in Rachel's conference room with James and Kate. There's a specific clause I didn't mention during my deposition. It covers discussions about corporate acquisition strategies and litigation tactics. James felt his stomach drop. So you can't testify about the executive meeting where they discussed suing Rachel if they couldn't buy her, not without violating the NDA. And Axiom's lawyers found the clause. They've already filed a motion to exclude that portion of my testimony. Kane's hands twisted together anxiously. I'm sorry. I should have been clearer from the beginning. Why weren't you? Kate couldn't quite keep the accusation from her voice. Because I was scared. Still am. Kane met their eyes with painful honesty. Axiom has deep pockets and a reputation for destroying people who cross them. I thought maybe the NDA wouldn't matter, that I could testify and deal with consequences later. But that was cowardice talking. What can you still testify about? James forced himself to focus on salvaging what remained rather than dwelling on what they'd lost. Technical matters. The state of Axiom's research during the consulting period. The fact that we studied Dr. Morgan's published work extensively. Kane's expression turned determined. I can't speak to litigation strategy, but I can establish that Axiom's technology was inferior to hers, that they were learning from her, not the other way around. It's not the smoking gun we wanted, but it's still valuable. James made mental notes about adjusting their trial strategy. We'll work with what we have. Week 5 brought the pivot that changed everything. Kate, digging ever deeper into discovery documents, found the email that transformed their case. She burst into James's makeshift office at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday, waving her laptop like a trophy. I found it. The proof we needed. James, this is huge. She set the laptop on his desk, and James read the email thread with growing amazement. Dated 3.5 years ago, from Axiom CEO James Thornton to his corporate development team. Subject: pure flow acquisition strategy. The content laid out a clear plan offer. Rachel, a high-paying executive position to hire her away from her own company. If she accepted, shelve the affordable technology and focus on premium markets. If she declined, consider IP litigation to tie up operations and force settlement. This is premeditation. James reread the email to make sure he wasn't misinterpreting. They planned to sue her before she ever did anything they could claim as theft. This was always Plan B. Kate practically vibrated with excitement. And it gets better. I found follow-up emails discussing her rejection of the job offer. 6 months later, almost to the day, they filed the lawsuit. The timeline proves the litigation was retaliation for not being bought out. James called Rachel immediately despite the late hour. She answered on the second ring, her voice alert rather than sleepy. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Everything's right. Did Axiom offer you a job about 3.5 years ago? Silence on the other end. Then Rachel's voice came through, carefully controlled. Yes, VP of Research, $2 million annually. How did you find out? We have the email where Thornton planned it, and we have proof they discussed litigation as the alternative if you refused. James couldn't keep the triumph from his voice. This demolishes their credibility. It proves the lawsuit isn't about protecting IP, it's about eliminating competition they couldn't acquire. Rachel's breath caught audibly. I turned down that job because I saw through it. They wanted to hire me to bury my own technology, price it beyond reach for the communities that need it most. Her voice hardened. I didn't spend 10 years developing life-saving technology just to turn it into a luxury product for rich people. And 6 months after you refused, they sued. The pattern is undeniable. James felt the pieces falling into place with satisfying precision. This is our offensive weapon. Axiom becomes the villain trying to suppress innovation they couldn't match through legitimate competition. The pause before Rachel spoke again felt weighted with more than legal strategy. Mr. Mitchell James, I may have been wrong about you. Wrong how? Though he suspected he knew. I thought you'd be like Brighton, looking for an exit when things got complicated. But you're actually fighting. Her voice carried wonder underneath the usual control. Really fighting, not just going through motions. I promised I would fight. I keep my promises. The words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what was shifting between them, but they were the best James had. I know that now. Another pause then, so quietly he almost missed it. Thank you. The line went dead before he could respond, but James sat holding the phone for a long moment afterward. Something had changed. Rachel's walls hadn't fallen completely, but they'd cracked enough for him to see the person underneath, brilliant and wounded and desperate to believe someone might actually stand beside her instead of abandoning her when things got difficult. Week 6 saw Axiom make their first settlement offer drop all claims in exchange for Rachel licensing her technology at favorable rates and signing a non-disparagement agreement. Rachel rejected it within an hour without consulting James, a fact that brought a surprised smile to his face when Kate told him. She was learning to trust her own judgment again. Week 7 brought a moment that shifted the dynamic between James and Rachel permanently. Late Thursday night, they were the last two in the office. Kate had gone home hours ago. The city lights spread below them like scattered diamonds, and Rachel stood at the window staring out at nothing in particular. "Can I ask you something personal?" Her reflection in the glass looked more vulnerable than James had ever seen her. "Of course. Why do you really believe in this case? Not the legal arguments or the evidence. Why does it matter to you personally?" She turned to face him, her usual composure fraying at the edges. "You gave up a comfortable life to become a janitor. Now you're risking your reputation, what's left of it, for a client you barely know. That's not rational." James considered deflecting with platitudes about justice and doing the right thing. But Rachel deserved better than platitudes. "Because for 5 years, I used my skills to help powerful people crush those weaker than them. I was exceptional at it, and it destroyed something in me that I'm still trying to rebuild." "Your wife." Rachel spoke the words gently, acknowledging the wound without prodding it. "Rebecca died because I chose work over family, over and over, every day, every case, until there was nothing left to choose." James moved to stand beside her at the window, close enough to feel her warmth but not touching. "This case is my chance to use those same skills for something that actually helps people, instead of grinding them into dust. You feel guilty, not an accusation, just observation. Every minute of every day. But guilt without action is just self-indulgence." He looked at her reflection, meeting his in the glass. "You're trying to provide clean water to communities that can't afford the systems wealthy areas take for granted. You're doing it at cost, sacrificing profit for mission. That matters. And protecting your ability to keep doing it, that's worth fighting for." Rachel was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for deception or ulterior motives. Whatever she found must have satisfied her, because when she spoke again, her voice carried something he'd never heard before. Not warmth exactly, but the possibility of it. "No one's ever said anything like that to me before." Her hand rose as if to touch his arm, then fell back to her side. "Most people think I'm too hard, too cold, too demanding. They don't understand that the mission requires those qualities." "I understand, and I don't need you to be warm or easy or accommodating. I just need you to be honest." James finally turned from the window to face her directly. "Can you do that even when the truth is difficult?" "Always." Rachel met his eyes without hesitation. "I don't know how to be anything else." "Good. Then we'll be fine." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, a connection, the sense of two people who'd both been broken by their pasts, finding unexpected kinship. Rachel's walls hadn't fallen, but perhaps they'd shifted just enough to let something grow underneath. Week 7 also brought Axiom's second settlement offer, more aggressive than the first $10 million cash, plus Axiom purchases PureFlow outright for $500 million full market value. Rachel could stay on as a consultant, but Axiom would control technology distribution. James watched her read the offer in his presence, saw the moment of temptation cross her face. $500 million was genuine money enough to retire wealthy and free of litigation stress. But it would also mean surrendering her mission to a corporation that cared only about profit. "What do you think?" Rachel asked, though her tone suggested she'd already decided. "I think they're scared. They wouldn't offer this much if they felt confident about winning." James closed the file with the offer inside. "But it's your choice, not mine. You're the one who has to live with whatever decision you make. If I take their money, I become complicit in the injustice." Rachel's voice hardened with resolve. "They'll price the technology beyond reach for poor communities. Everything my mother died for becomes meaningless. Then you have your answer." James felt pride and relief in equal measure. She was choosing principle over pragmatic safety, and he respected that enormously. "I do." Rachel picked up her phone and dialed Axiom's general counsel, directly rejecting the offer in terms that left no room for negotiation. When she hung up, she looked at James with something approaching vulnerability. I hope we're not making a mistake. We're not. We have the truth and the evidence and the moral high ground. Sometimes that has to be enough. He wished he felt as confident as he sounded. The final week before trial brought an incident that reminded them both how high the stakes were. Dr. Kane called with news that complicated their strategy further. James, I'll testify as we discussed. But someone broke into my house last night. Are you hurt? Was anything taken? James felt cold dread settling in his stomach. No and no, but they left a message, a note saying testifying has consequences. Kane's voice shook slightly. My wife is terrified. She wants me to refuse a subpoena. I can request protection from the court. Witness intimidation is a crime. James was already making notes about filing an emergency motion. I'm still going to testify. Kane's words came out determined despite his obvious fear. But I wanted you to know what we're dealing with. These aren't just lawyers filing papers. They're willing to cross lines. The incident reinforced what James already knew. Axiom viewed this lawsuit as war, not litigation. They'd bribed Brighton, threatened Kane, and now escalated to physical intimidation. The desperation suggested weakness, but it also made them more dangerous. 2 days before trial, James sat with Sophie at their kitchen table, exhausted but trying to be present. She'd been patient during these intense weeks, understanding without complaint when he worked late or brought files home or seemed distracted during dinner. Now she studied him with 12-year-old directness that missed nothing. You're scared about the trial, not a question, an observation. Terrified, no point lying to someone who knew him this well. Why, you've prepared everything, you have good evidence, and you're fighting for someone who deserves it. Sophie set down her pen, giving him her complete attention. Because Strand is better than me, more experience, better resources, and he wants to win this more than just professionally. James ran his hands through his hair, letting the anxiety surface. I've been out of practice for 6 years. What if I've forgotten something critical? What if I make a mistake that costs Rachel everything? Sophie reached across and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. Dad, you taught me something important when I was learning to ride my bike. You said being nervous means you care about doing it right. People who don't care don't get nervous. I remember. James smiled despite his worry. So be nervous, but trust your skills, trust your preparation, and trust that you're fighting for truth. She squeezed his hand once before letting go. That's all you can control. The rest is up to the jury. When did you get so wise? The question came out thick with emotion. I learned from watching the best father anyone could have. Sophie's smile lit her whole face. Now go win this case so we can celebrate. The night before trial, James couldn't sleep. He lay in bed reviewing arguments in his mind, second-guessing strategy choices, worrying about witnesses and cross-examination, and 1,000 things that could go wrong. Finally, he gave up and went to the kitchen, made coffee, spread his notes across the table one more time. His phone buzzed with a text from Rachel at 2 a.m. Can't sleep either. Thank you for everything. Whatever happens tomorrow, you gave me something. I'd lost hope that someone actually fights for what's right instead of what's profitable. James typed back, get some rest. Tomorrow we show them what truth looks like. But he didn't sleep either. Just sat in his kitchen watching the sky lighten from black to gray to the pale gold of dawn, preparing himself mentally for the battle ahead. 6 years ago, he'd walked away from this world. Now he was walking back in, and the outcome would determine not just Rachel's future, but his own sense of whether redemption was possible or just a comfortable lie, he told himself. The courthouse steps were mobbed when James arrived at 8:30 Monday morning. News crews had staked out positions overnight. Reporters shouted questions as he pushed through the crowd. The story had captured public imagination, the janitor defending a billionaire against corporate intimidation, David versus Goliath with a legal twist. Inside courtroom 6 felt different than it had for the preliminary hearing. More crowded, more tense, charged with the electricity of a trial that would determine everything. Strand and his team occupied the plaintiff's table with military precision, surrounded by technology and exhibits, in the confidence of people who expected to win. Rachel arrived 15 minutes later, flanked by Kate, and looking every inch the successful executive in her tailored suit and severe hairstyle. But when she caught James's eye, the mask slipped just enough for him to see the fear underneath. She was terrified, and she was trusting him to save her. The weight of that trust pressed against James's chest as he stood to greet her. Ready as I'll ever be, Rachel took her seat beside him at the defendant's table. Her hand found his under the table again, that brief touch that had become their private signal of solidarity. Judge Hartley entered at exactly 9 a.m., her expression grave. All rise. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmur of conversation, and everyone stood as one. James felt his heart hammering, but his hands were steady. 6 years away. 6 years of hiding and rebuilding and trying to atone for past sins. Now the moment of truth had arrived. Be seated. The judge settled behind her bench and surveyed the packed courtroom. We are here for the trial of Axiom Technologies versus Pure Flow Systems and Dr. Rachel Morgan. Opening statements will now begin. Mr. Strand, you may proceed. The trial unfolded with brutal efficiency over the first week. Strand called Axiom engineers who testified about Rachel's access to their research database during the consulting period. Computer logs showed she'd viewed files on filtration systems, UV sterilization protocols, cost optimization models. Each witness built another brick in the wall of suspicion. Access plus opportunity plus financial motive painted a picture of theft that looked damning on its surface. James cross-examined each engineer with surgical precision, forcing them to acknowledge facts they'd rather have avoided. Yes, they'd studied Rachel's published papers extensively. Yes, those papers predated her consulting work. Yes, the basic technologies they claimed as proprietary ceramic filtration, UV sterilization, modular design were industry standards anyone could use. With each admission, James chipped away at the narrative Strand had constructed so carefully in his opening. The fourth day brought Dr. Stephen Bradford to the stand. Axiom's expert witness carried impressive credentials, 30 years at M1T consultant for Fortune 500 companies, author of 3 textbooks on water purification technology. He'd reviewed both systems exhaustively and reached conclusions that looked devastating for Rachel's defense. Strand walked Bradford through his analysis with practiced ease. In your expert opinion, Dr. Bradford, are the similarities between Axiom's filtration system and PureFlow's system consistent with independent development? Number bar, Bradford's voice carried absolute certainty. The similarities are too extensive, too specific. The mathematical ratios used in the filtration process, the configuration of the modular assembly, the integration of ceramic and UV elements. These show clear evidence of shared development or appropriation. And in your professional judgment, which is more likely independent development or appropriation? Given the timeline, Dr. Morgan's access to Axiom's research, followed by launch of a remarkably similar product appropriation, is the only reasonable conclusion. Bradford's testimony felt like a door slamming shut on Rachel's chances. Strand passed the witness with obvious satisfaction. James stood and approached the jury box carrying only a copy of Bradford's expert report and Rachel's Ph.D. dissertation. Dr. Bradford, you've testified that the similarities between systems are too extensive for independent development. Let's examine that claim. He opened the dissertation to a flagged page. This is Dr. Morgan's Ph.D. research from 2019, 3 years before she consulted for Axiom. Does this document describe a ceramic UV filtration combination? Bradford shifted in his seat. It does, but please just answer the question. Does it describe such a combination? Yes. James flipped to another marked section. Does this section detail mathematical optimization of flow rates? It appears to, but the specific ratios are right here, documented and dated. He held up the page so the jury could see the equations. These are the same ratios you claim she appropriated from Axiom, correct? Bradford's composure cracked slightly. The ratios are similar, but context matters. The implementation. Let's talk about implementation. James pulled out Bradford's expert report. In your report, you state, and I quote, "The combination of ceramic filtration and UV sterilization shows clear influence." But you also published a paper in 2018 using that exact combination, didn't you? That's different. My paper was theoretical, not commercial application, so the combination itself isn't proprietary or unique. It's a known approach in the field. James didn't wait for an answer. You also cite the modular design as evidence of theft. But modular design is standard across the water filtration industry, isn't it? In general, yes, but the specific configuration, can you identify one concrete element, Not a combination, not a configuration, but one specific innovation that is uniquely Axiom's proprietary design. And that Dr. Morgan stole. James's voice sharpened. Not vague similarities. One specific thing. Bradford fumbled with his notes, flipping through pages, looking for the answer James knew wasn't there. The integrated system as a whole, one specific element. Doctor, a formula unique to Axiom, a measurement they invented, a component they designed. Name one. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and revealing. Bradford finally tried to recover. The specific flow rate optimization demonstrates. James interrupted by holding up Rachel's dissertation again. Is documented here in 2019. Published in peer-reviewed journals in the 2020. Available to anyone who bothered to read academic literature. So I'll ask one more time. Can you name a single specific proprietary innovation Axiom developed that Dr. Morgan stole? Bradford's face flushed. I focused on the overall pattern of similarities rather than actually identifying what was allegedly stolen. James closed the dissertation. Dr. Bradford, you're a respected expert, but your opinion in this case is built on assumptions rather than evidence. You assumed theft because of access and timing. You never verified whether the innovations existed in Dr. Morgan's work first. That's not expert analysis. That's confirmation bias. Objection. Strand was on his feet. Argumentative. Sustained. Judge Hartley's tone suggested she agreed with James's point, even if the phrasing crossed a line. Mr. Mitchell asked questions. James nodded. Dr. Bradford, did you review Dr. Morgan's complete research history before forming your opinion about theft? I reviewed materials provided by Axiom's counsel. That's not what I asked. Did you review her PhD dissertation from 2019? No. That wasn't in my scope of work. Did you review her published papers from 2020? No. So you formed an opinion about whether she stole innovations without examining whether those innovations existed in her prior work. James let that statement hang in the air. No further questions. Bradford left the stand looking diminished, his expert credibility badly damaged. Two jurors were taking notes furiously. Another stared at Strand with an expression that suggested betrayal. They had been told this was an open and shut case, and James had just proved it was anything but. The prosecution rested after 5 days of testimony. Now came the defense, and James's first witness would either vindicate their strategy or expose them to devastating cross-examination. The defense calls Thomas Brighton. The courtroom stirred with surprise. Brighton hadn't been on the witness list. Strand had seen James had filed an emergency motion to add him just 3 days ago, and Judge Hartley had allowed it over Strand's vigorous objection. Now the former attorney walked to the stand looking like a man marching toward his own execution. After Brighton was sworn in, James approached with deliberate calm. Mr. Brighton, you represented Dr. Morgan for 8 months before withdrawing from this case, correct? Yes. Brighton's voice came out barely above a whisper. Why did you withdraw? I sent an email claiming irreconcilable differences with the client. That was a lie. The courtroom went utterly silent. The truth is, I was paid to withdraw. The gallery erupted. Judge Hartley's gavel came down hard. Order, I will have order. James waited for the chaos to settle before continuing. Who paid you? Axiom Technologies. Through a shell company, but it traces back to them. $200,000 deposited to my account 2 days before I sent that withdrawal email. Brighton's hands shook where they gripped the witness stand railing. Did you want to withdraw? No, I believed Dr. Morgan's case had merit. But Axiom's attorneys contacted me privately. They offered the money and threatened to fabricate ethics violations against me if I refused. His voice strengthened slightly. I have a family. I was scared. So I took their money and abandoned my client when she needed me most. Your Honor, Stranda's face had gone purple with rage. This is outrageous. These are unsubstantiated allegations, Mr. Mitchell. Do you have evidence supporting this testimony? Judge Hartley's expression suggested she was taking the allegations very seriously. Yes, Your Honor. James nodded to Kate, who brought forward a file folder. Bank records showing the payment, emails between Mr. Brighton and Axiom's general counsel discussing the withdrawal, all authenticated and verified. I want those documents. Now. The judge's voice could have frozen water. Kate handed the file to the bailiff, who delivered it to Judge Hartley. The courtroom held its breath while she reviewed the contents. Her expression grew darker with each page. Mr. Strand, your client has a lot to answer for. This is witness tampering at minimum, possibly obstruction of justice. I'm referring this matter to the district attorney's office for investigation. Strand looked like he'd been struck. Your Honor, we had no knowledge. Save it. Judge Hartley's gavel came down. This court takes a dim view of anyone who corrupts the legal process. She turned to Brighton. Mr. Brighton, you're dismissed as a witness, but you will remain available for further questioning by law enforcement. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor. Brighton stood on unsteady legs and left the stand. He'd destroyed his own reputation, but he'd also delivered a devastating blow to Axiom's credibility. The defense calls Dr. Robert Kane. Kane took the stand with visible nervousness, his eyes darting to where Axiom's representative sat in the gallery. But once James began questioning the scientist's expertise, took over, and he spoke with growing confidence about Axiom's research during Rachel's consulting period. Dr. Kane, what was the status of Axiom's water filtration technology when Dr. Morgan worked there preliminary? We had concepts but significant technical problems. Our systems weren't production ready. Kane's voice grew stronger as he detailed the struggles Axiom had faced. We couldn't match the efficiency levels Dr. Morgan had published in her academic papers. Did Axiom's research team study Dr. Morgan's published work extensively? Her papers were required reading for everyone in our department. We were trying to understand how she'd achieved such high performance at such low cost. Kane looked directly at the jury. We were learning from her, not the other way around. Strand's cross-examination tried to paint Kane as bitter about his departure from Axiom, but the scientist held firm. Yes, he'd left under difficult circumstances. No, that didn't make his testimony about Axiom's research status any less accurate. He'd been there. He'd led the team. He knew what they could and couldn't do. The defense calls Dr. Jennifer Ross. Ross was everything Bradford wasn't: precise, specific, and devastatingly effective. She'd reviewed both systems with exhaustive thoroughness and reached conclusions that systematically dismantled Axiom's case. Dr. Ross, did you examine both PureFlow's system and Axiom's water system? Yes. Complete technical specifications for both, plus Dr. Morgan's graduate research and published papers. Ross's voice carried the authority of someone absolutely certain of her facts. What did you conclude? That Dr. Morgan's system is clearly original. Not only is it not derivative of Axiom's work, it's superior in several key metrics. The innovation isn't in individual components, but in the elegant integration of those components, the mathematical optimization and the manufacturing process that enables affordability without sacrificing quality. She walked the jury through technical explanations that made complex engineering accessible. Think of it like cooking. Anyone can buy flour, eggs, and sugar, but that doesn't mean everyone can bake the same cake. Dr. Morgan's innovation is in the recipe, how she combines standard ingredients in ways no one else had thought of. That's not theft, that's the comparison resonated. James saw understanding dawn on several jurors' faces. Brilliance. Did you find any evidence that Dr. Morgan appropriated Axiom's intellectual property? None whatsoever. Ross spoke with finality. In fact, I found evidence of the opposite. Axiom's research papers from 2022 and 2023 cite Dr. Morgan's published work as inspiration. They were trying to learn from her. Strand tried to shake Ross on cross-examination but made no headway. She was too knowledgeable, too specific, too convincing. By the time she left the stand, the jury's expressions had shifted from skepticism about Rachel to outright suspicion of Axiom's motives. The defense calls Dr. Rachel Morgan. This was the moment everything hinged on Rachel's own testimony, her chance to explain in her own words what had happened and why. She took the stand with her usual controlled grace, but James noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she was sworn in. He walked her through her background methodically. The childhood in a working-class family. The tragedy in West Virginia that had shaped her life's mission. The years of education and research. The breakthrough that became PureFlow. Dr. Morgan, why did you create this technology? Rachel's voice remained steady, but emotion leaked through at the edges. My mother died from drinking contaminated water. I was 16. I watched her suffer for 3 days before her organs failed. The doctor said if we'd caught it earlier, if the water had been tested, if a basic filtration system had been in place, she might have lived. She paused, gathering herself. I became an engineer so that other children wouldn't have to watch their mothers die from something so preventable. That's all I've ever wanted. To make clean water accessible to people who can't afford the expensive systems wealthy communities take for granted. Tell the jury about your research process. Rachel explained her graduate work in detail, the years of testing different filtration materials, the mathematical modeling of flow dynamics, the iterative process of design and redesign. Every innovation was documented in lab notebooks that had been entered into evidence. Every breakthrough was published in peer-reviewed journals. The timeline was irrefutable. Did you develop this technology before consulting for Axiom years before? My PhD dissertation in 2019 contains every core innovation they claim I stole. The ceramic UV combination, the flow rate optimization, the modular design. It is documented there with timestamps and faculty signatures. Why did you consult for Axiom if you already had your own company? Rachel's expression turned rueful. They approached me, said they wanted to expand into humanitarian water projects. I was naive enough to believe them. I thought working with a large corporation might help me scale production faster, reach more communities. What happened during the consulting period? I worked on completely different projects than my own research. They had me analyzing their commercial filtration systems for office buildings and industrial facilities. High-end, high-margin products. Nothing related to the affordable systems PureFlow makes. Did you access their research files? Yes. That was part of the consulting agreement. I needed to understand their existing technology to make recommendations. Rachel leaned forward slightly. But here's what's crucial. Their research files showed they were years behind where my published papers already were. I wasn't learning from them. I was seeing how far ahead my approach was. James introduced the email from CEO Thornton about the acquisition strategy. Tell the jury about the job offer you received after the consulting ended. They offered me VP of Research at $2 million annually. Rachel's voice hardened. In the negotiations, it became clear what they really wanted. They wanted to hire me to shelve the affordable technology, focus only on premium markets where profit margins were higher, price clean water so high that only wealthy communities could afford it. Her hands gripped the railing of the witness box. I didn't spend 10 years developing technology to save lives just to turn it into a luxury product for rich people. My mother didn't die so I could help corporations maximize profits. I refused, and 6 months later, they sued you. Exactly. When they couldn't buy me, they decided to destroy me. This lawsuit has nothing to do with protecting intellectual property. It's about eliminating competition they can't match through legitimate innovation. James let her words resonate before asking his final question. Dr. Morgan, did you steal anything from Axiom Technologies? Rachel looked directly at the jury, her voice ringing with conviction. Number one, I did not. Every innovation in PureFlow's system came from my own research, my own work, my own mind. They're trying to take credit for things I invented years before I ever met them. That's not justice, that's theft. Your witness. James returned to his seat, confident that Rachel had connected with the jury on both intellectual and emotional levels. Strand approached the witness stand like a shark scenting blood. His cross-examination began with surgical politeness that masked the attack coming. Dr. Morgan, you're quite wealthy now, aren't you? On paper, at least, Rachel's composure held. PureFlow is valued at approximately $800 million, yes. You stand to lose all of that if this jury finds against you. I stand to lose my ability to provide clean water to communities that need it. The money is secondary. Strand smiled without warmth. How noble. Yet you live quite comfortably despite your claimed humanitarian mission. Don't you? I live modestly. I reinvest most profits into expanding operations. You drive a 10-year-old Honda, correct? Yes. Very humble. Strand's sarcasm dripped. But you also own PureFlow outright. If you sold the company tomorrow for $800 million, you'd be personally wealthy beyond most people's dreams. If I sold it to someone who'd continue the mission, perhaps. But companies like Axiom would bury the affordable technology and maximize profits. That's not something I'm willing to do. Rachel's voice stayed level despite Strand's provocations. Let's talk about your time at Axiom. Strand pulled out computer logs. You accessed their research database 347 times during your 6-month consulting period. That's more than once per day on average. I was consulting on their technology. Of course I Access their files. That was my job. You viewed files on filtration systems, on UV sterilization, on cost optimization. Strand read from a list, all areas central to PureFlow's technology, all areas central to water purification generally. Rachel's composure held. Those are standard research topics in the field. Convenient, Strand's voice sharpened. You view Axiom's files and 18 months later, you launch a product using remarkably similar approaches. You claim that's coincidence, I claim that's chronology. My approaches existed first. The documents prove it. Strand tried different angles of attack over the next 2 hours. He questioned her memory of specific files. He suggested her published papers were vague enough to allow for later refinement using Axiom's specifics. He painted her rejection of the job offer as evidence of guilt rather than principle. But Rachel held firm on every point. Yes, she'd accessed files. No, she hadn't used anything proprietary. Yes, the systems had surface similarities. No, those similarities didn't prove theft when her innovations predated Axiom's work by years. Her controlled demeanor never cracked, though James could see the exhaustion building behind her eyes. Finally, Strand played what he clearly thought was his trump card. Doctor. Morgan, you have testified extensively about your humanitarian mission. But isn't it true that you're also motivated by beating Axiom in the marketplace? By proving your technology is superior to theirs? Rachel's expression turned to steel. I'm motivated by providing clean water to people who need it. If that happens to prove my technology is superior, which it is, then yes, I'm satisfied by that outcome. But competition through innovation is how markets are supposed to work. What Axiom is doing using lawsuits to crush competitors they can't beat fairly, that's the real crime here. Strand had no response that wouldn't make things worse. No further questions. Rachel left the stand with her head high, and James felt a surge of pride. She'd faced Strand's attack and emerged unshaken. The jury had seen her strength and her conviction and the truth that burned underneath the corporate warfare. That evening after court adjourned, Kate burst into the conference room where James and Rachel were reviewing the day's testimony. Her laptop was open and her face carried an expression James had learned meant significant discovery. I found something. You need to hear this right now. She set the laptop on the table and pressed play. Audio filled the room, a phone conversation, voices slightly distorted but intelligible. Where are we on the Chen litigation? The first voice belonged to James Thornton, Axiom's CEO. Kate had included a voice print analysis confirming identity. Trials underway. Could go either way. The second voice was Axiom's general counsel. I don't care what it case. Destroy her. Get me that technology. Thornton's words came through cold and clear. Sir, our case has weaknesses. The timeline evidence is problematic. Then bury her in legal fees until she can't fight anymore. That's what litigation is for, wearing down opponents who can't afford prolonged battles. Thornton's voice held ugly certainty. Only if we lose do people question our methods. And we won't lose because we have Strand. That could be seen as abuse of process. The general counsel sounded uncomfortable. Only if we lose. And we won't. The recording ended. James stared at the laptop. Where did this come from? Anonymous email sent to me an hour ago. Kate pulled up the message. No return address, but the metadata suggests it came from inside Axiom's corporate network. Probably a whistleblower. This is explosive. Rachel's voice carried wonder. This proves they know their case is weak. That they're using litigation as a weapon, not legitimate. IP protection. Can we use it at trial? James's mind was already racing through evidentiary issues. We need to authenticate it, establish a chain of custody, potentially trace the source. I ran audio forensics. Kate clicked through files showing waveform analysis and voice matching. It's genuine. Thornton's voice matches known recordings. The phone system metadata shows it was recorded 3 days ago from Axiom's corporate line. But who sent it to us, and will Judge Hartley allow it this late in trial? James felt hope and doubt warring in his chest. Only one way to find out. Rachel stood decisively. File an emergency motion tonight. Get it in front of the judge first thing tomorrow. James drafted the motion while Kate prepared authentication exhibits, and Rachel ordered dinner none of them would eat. By midnight, they'd compiled everything needed, the recording, the forensic analysis, the legal arguments for why it should be admitted, despite the late disclosure. The emergency hearing convened at 8 a.m. the next morning, before the jury arrived. Judge Hartley listened to the recording 3 times, her expression growing progressively darker. Mr. Strand, your response? Her voice could have cut diamond. Strand looked shaken, his usual confidence badly frayed. Your Honor, this is inadmissible. We don't know who recorded it or how it was obtained. It could be illegally intercepted communication. Chain of custody is non-existent. Mr. Mitchell, the judge turned expectant eyes toward James. Your Honor, the recording is authenticated through voice analysis and phone system metadata. As for legality, if it was recorded from within Axiom's own phone system, as the metadata suggests, it may fall under one-party consent if the person who sent it was party to the call or had authorized access to the system. James stood and approached the bench. More importantly, this is a statement against interest by Axiom's CEO admitting the lawsuit is harassment rather than legitimate IP protection. It's directly relevant to the central issues of this case. The jury deserves to hear it. Strand objected with increasing desperation. Your Honor, this is prejudicial, even if authentic, taking it out of context. The context is your client's CEO admitting to litigation abuse. Judge Hartley's tone left no room for argument. I'm going to allow it. Mr. Mitchell may play the recording for the jury. Mr. Strand, if you can prove it was illegally obtained, you may file a motion to strike. But for now, it comes in. Strand's face went gray. Note our objection for the record. When the jury returned, James played the recording. The courtroom went absolutely silent except for Thornton's damning words, destroy her. Bury her in legal fees. That's what litigation is for, wearing down opponents. Several jurors' expressions shifted from neutral assessment to visible anger. This wasn't about protecting intellectual property. This was corporate warfare admitted in the CEO's own voice. Strand tried damage control by calling a technology expert to testify that voice recordings could be manipulated, but the witness couldn't dispute the forensic analysis Kate had provided. The recording was genuine. The admission was real. Axiom's credibility collapsed like a house of cards. The defense rests. James spoke the words with quiet confidence. Closing arguments began the following morning. Strand went first, trying to salvage what he could from the wreckage of his case. Ladies and gentlemen, don't be distracted by emotional appeals or last-minute recordings taken out of context. Focus on the central facts. Dr. Morgan had access to Axiom's research. She viewed their proprietary files. She launched a product with similar technology. Those facts haven't changed regardless of inflammatory statements by executives who weren't involved in the technical development. He spoke for 30 minutes, but the energy was gone. His arguments felt hollow after Thornton's recorded admission. The jury looked unconvinced, some openly skeptical. Mr. Mitchell, you're closing. Judge Hartley's voice carried encouragement James hadn't heard since the trial began. James stood and faced the jury for the final time. 3 weeks ago, Mr. Strand told you this case was about intellectual property theft. He promised overwhelming evidence. He said the facts were clear. But what have you actually learned? He moved to stand directly before the jury box. You learned that every innovation Axiom claims Dr. Morgan stole existed in her work years before she ever met them. PhD research from 2019, published papers from 2020, patents from 2021, all documented, all public, all predating the supposed theft. You learned from Axiom's own research director that they were studying Dr. Morgan's published work because her approach was more advanced than theirs. They were learning from her, not vice versa. You learned that Axiom tried to buy Dr. Morgan's company, and when she refused, they filed this lawsuit, not to protect their rights, but to eliminate competition they couldn't match through innovation. James's voice strengthened with conviction. You learned that Axiom bribed Dr. Morgan's attorney to abandon her before a critical hearing, witness tampering to leave her defenseless. And you heard in Axiom's own CEO's voice admission that this lawsuit is about destroying her through legal costs. That litigation is a weapon to wear down opponents who can't afford prolonged battles. That's not justice. That's abuse of the legal system. He paused, letting the weight of evidence settle. Mr. Strand asked you to ignore all of that and focus only on access and similarity. But access means nothing when the innovations already existed in Dr. Morgan's prior work. Similarity means nothing when the technologies in question are industry standards anyone can use. The truth is simple. Dr. Rachel Morgan invented a revolutionary water filtration system. She documented it thoroughly. She published it openly. She built a company to provide clean water to communities that desperately need it. And when Axiom couldn't compete, they tried to destroy her. James met each juror's eyes. This case is about more than patents and corporate law. It's about whether innovation gets rewarded or punished, whether truth matters more than money and power, whether ordinary people like you can stand against corporate intimidation and say, no, this isn't right, and we won't allow it. His voice dropped to conversational intimacy. I'm asking you to deliver a verdict based on facts, not fear. The facts show Dr. Morgan invented first. The facts show Axiom learned from her. The facts show this lawsuit is retaliation disguised as IP protection. The facts demand a verdict of not guilty on all charges. He stepped back, his final words ringing through the courtroom. Send a message that in America, truth still defeats lies, that justice is still possible, that corporations can't crush innovation through legal warfare. Fine for Dr. Rachel Morgan. Thank you. The jury filed out to begin deliberations at 2 p.m. Then came the hardest part, waiting. James, Rachel, and Kate sat in a conference room down the hall, unable to eat or focus or do anything except watch the clock and wonder. Sophie called at 4. How are you holding up, Dad? Terrified. James appreciated her directness. The jury's been out 2 hours. Could be quick. Could be days. They'll do the right thing. Sophie's confidence felt like a lifeline. You gave them everything they needed to see the truth. Trust them. Trying to. He wanted to believe his daughter's faith was justified. 6 p.m. came and went. Courthouse staff began leaving for the day. Judge Hartley sent word that if the jury hadn't reached a verdict by 7, they'd break for the evening and resume tomorrow. At 6:45, the bailiff knocked on the conference room door. They have a verdict. James's heart stuttered. That fast, after less than 5 hours, fast verdicts could mean anything. Clear guilt, clear innocence, or a jury so divided they'd compromised just to go home. There was no way to know until the foreman spoke. The courtroom filled rapidly, word of a verdict had spread, and spectators rushed back in. Strand and his team took their positions, looking tense. Rachel sat beside James with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. All rise. Judge Hartley entered and everyone stood. Be seated. Please bring in the jury. The 12 filed in, their faces carefully neutral. James tried to read their expressions and found nothing. Several looked at Rachel, others avoided eye contact entirely. His stomach twisted with anxiety. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Hartley's voice remained professionally neutral. We have your honor. The foreman, the retired teacher, a woman in her 60s, stood and unfolded a paper. Please read it. In the matter of Axiom Technologies versus Pure Flow Systems and Dr. Rachel Morgan on the charge of intellectual property theft, we find the defendant not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Rachel gasped and Kate grabbed her arm. James felt his knees go weak with relief so profound it was almost painful. On the charge of fraud, we find the defendant not guilty. More cheers from the gallery. Someone was crying, probably one of Rachel's employees. On the charge of breach of contract, we find the defendant not guilty. Rachel turned to James and tears were streaming down her face, all pretense of control abandoned. For this one moment, she embraced him tightly, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Order. Judge Hartley's gavel came down repeatedly. The foreman isn't finished. The jury wishes to note for the record, the foreman's voice carried steel underneath the professional courtesy, that we found credible evidence of malicious prosecution by the plaintiff. We believe this lawsuit was filed in bad faith to harm a competitor rather than protect legitimate intellectual property rights. Judge Hartley nodded gravely. So noted. Dr. Morgan, you are cleared of all charges. Axiom's lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice, meaning it cannot be refiled. She turned to Strand, and her expression could have frozen fire. Furthermore, given the evidence presented regarding witness tampering, bribery, and litigation abuse, I am sanctioning Axiom Technologies. They will pay Dr. Morgan's attorney fees and costs in full. Additionally, I am referring this matter to the State Bar for investigation into potential ethical violations by Axiom's legal team. Strand sat frozen, his career likely ending in real time. The sanctions and bar investigation would follow him forever. This case should never have been brought to trial. Judge Hartley's final words rang with condemnation. Court is adjourned. The gavel sounded and chaos erupted. Kate joined the embrace between James and Rachel. Reporters swarmed toward them, shouting questions. Pure Flow employees in the gallery cheered and hugged each other. James barely registered any of it. He just held Rachel while she cried tears of relief and vindication and the release of months of crushing stress. When she finally pulled back, her face was blotchy and makeup streaked and more human than he'd ever seen it. "Thank you. I don't have words," Rachel's voice broke. "You don't need words." James smiled through his own tears. "You were innocent. The jury saw it. Justice happened. Because you made it happen." She grabbed his hand, squeezing hard. "You fought when you had nothing to gain. That's heroism. I'm no hero, just someone who remembered how to fight for what's right." But the words felt hollow because part of him knew this victory meant something profound, proof that leaving hadn't been cowardice, that returning hadn't been a mistake, that redemption might actually be possible. 3 months later, James stood in his converted garage office surrounded by law books and carpentry tools in harmonious chaos. He'd accepted Rachel's offer to become PureFlow's part-time general counsel, a position that let him practice law on his own terms while maintaining the balance he'd worked so hard to achieve. The carpentry tools still got used. He'd just finished building Sophie a treehouse that was the envy of her friends. The legal work was meaningful. He'd taken 2 more cases since the trial, both involving small companies being crushed by larger competitors using litigation as a weapon. He'd won both. Rachel appeared in the doorway holding 2 coffee cups. "Thought you might need this. You're a lifesaver." James accepted the coffee gratefully. They'd been seeing each other for 6 weeks now. Dinner dates that turned into long conversations, weekend hikes with Sophie, where Rachel's severe facade melted into something warm and real. It wasn't passionate romance. Neither of them was built for that. But it was connection, companionship, the slow building of trust between 2 people who'd both been broken by life and were learning to be whole again. "Sophie loves the treehouse you built." Rachel settled into the chair across from his desk. She helped design it. James smiled at the memory of his daughter sketching plans with engineering precision that would have made Rachel proud. "She's remarkable, like her father." Rachel's voice carried affection that would have been impossible months ago. His phone rang, a new client consultation, a family farmer facing foreclosure from a bank using fraudulent documentation. The kind of case that would never have crossed James's desk at Blackwell and Associates, but that mattered intensely to people who had nowhere else to turn. "I should let you prepare." Rachel stood but leaned down to kiss his forehead before leaving. "Dinner tonight, pizza with Sophie, Friday tradition." James grinned. "But tomorrow it's a date." She left with a smile that transformed her face. James turned to the farmer's case file, but his mind wandered to the journey that had brought him here. 7 years ago, he'd been a corporate attorney who'd lost sight of everything that mattered. 6 years ago, he'd been a grieving widower trying to rebuild a life from ashes. 3 months ago, he'd been a janitor who'd somehow found the courage to stand up and fight. Now he was something new, a hybrid of all those identities integrated into something whole. He practiced law with skill honed by years of experience, but tempered by wisdom earned through loss. He remained present for Sophie while also pursuing meaningful work. He'd found connection with someone who understood brokenness because she'd been broken too. The road hadn't been easy. The choices had required sacrifice. But standing in his garage office with law books on one shelf and carpentry tools on another, James Mitchell finally understood what his daughter had been trying to tell him all along. You didn't have to choose between who you were and who you wanted to be. You just had to be brave enough to become someone who could hold both truths at once. Some people would call it redemption. Others would call it second chances. James just called it living messy and complicated and imperfect, but authentic in ways his old life had never been. The phone rang again. Another client, another case, another opportunity to use power for protection instead of oppression. James answered it with a smile. Because this was what mattered, not winning or losing, not money or status or validation from people who didn't understand. Just the simple, profound act of standing up when someone needed help and fighting for what was right. Everything else was just noise.